Now is on services that would fall really under the auspices of this committee. So that's corporate services, financial services we've looked at this morning, property services and regulatory services. I'm going to start with Tom Pennell, who's going to highlight the issues around economic development.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll be brief given the amount of time allocated. Appendix F covers 4 related areas: economic development, planning, housing and strategic property issues. As Mr Colton's just mentioned, operational property issues covered in one of the other appendices. Paragraphs 3 to 13 provide some background describing current arrangements in the county, with the county council and districts providing a range of services between them which impact on the economy. Paragraphs 14 to 38 set out opportunities presented by a unitary structure and a split across a number of thematic headings. And as this morning, I don't intend to go through those in details, but perhaps what I'll do now is just quickly pick out some key strategic opportunities. So one of those is around the new council having clout. A single large council being better able to influence national government, including policy and funding allocations, likewise influencing Homes England, Highways England and other agencies like that. A simpler single interface with key local partnerships, for example the local enterprise partnership and Midlands Engine. Better integration of key services and plans, and I think in particular a better join up between planning for new homes and the provision of key infrastructure. A single council planning for development and infrastructure alongside each other, both strategically across the county and in relation to specific sites. Associated benefits in terms of negotiating developer contributions through section 106 with the developers, one council negotiating with infrastructure needs taken fully into account. Paragraph 19 refers to the fact that those making planning decisions at district level aren't responsible for the mitigation of many of the key impacts of the development, roads, schools, flooding, for example. Strategy and policy rationalisation, one local plan instead of 8, a single housing strategy. And there is some evidence that does lead to more housing delivery. So Res Publica have done some work which indicates that that unitary county areas are better at providing homes for new households than two-tier areas, and they refer to the fact of 60% of single-tier county areas meet a target of 95% of new households being provided with new homes, and it's just 30% in two-tier areas, so quite a big difference. As with other services, reduced management costs, a single housing service, a single planning service, a single economic development service, potentially all a single property service, potentially part of a single departmental structure. And you'll see at the end of the papers, or the end of this paper, paragraph 100, how Cornwall and Wiltshire bring those services together into single directorates, although Wiltshire have the housing service separate from the other services. And indeed, para 41 refers to the example of Northumberland, where they say that 50% fewer local planning staff were needed after the unitarisation happened. Paragraph 28 onwards describes the opportunities in relation to housing services. So there's quite a bit in there. Perhaps just use one example, and that's the benefits of a centralised choice-based letting service with lower administrative costs and one single authority for registered partners to work with, and the single service across the whole county, giving people more choice in terms of social housing. So I'll leave it at there by way of an introduction.
Chris, anything to add on? No, okay, not from a finance point of view. Right, Bill Bolter.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, page 94, paragraph 13. I know we're only small, but we're perfectly formed. But we don't appear to be on here as our own housing stock, and we have. It's got down here Charnwood Borough Council, Melton Council, North West Leicestershire, and we are missing.
Well, apologies for that.
I shall see you grovelling later. Yes, fine.
I think Hinckley's missing as well from that list.
Yes, I think so.
We've got a few council.
Hinckley owns his stock.
Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's
Two corrections there then.
quite a
very good stock
major
it is too.
major error.
Wonderful
You
stock.
mentioned also choice-based lettings as being one item that you've got down here. Also could help. Unless you didn't know there was a choice-based letting system in operation until last year, and we pulled out of that because of our location near Leicester City, and we couldn't fit in with the criteria for that. Residential criteria is that you have to be in the area for 6 months before you can apply for the register. Well, in the Leicester City it's 2 years, so we changed to 2 years as well. That being the case, we couldn't continue with the choice-based letting. We being near the city, if we'd have kept 6 months, we'd have been swamped by residents from the city moving into the district. So we moved away from that. And of course, you face the same problem if you move back to choice-based letting. It would, well, you'd lose all the housing stock within 6 months by other people coming in. So just a point of.
I think just on our latter point, obviously a new council would need to consider the geography of a centralised choice-based letting service, and whether that would be for the full county, and indeed what the criteria and thresholds would be. And I think also it would be potentially, with a single council covering a county, there would be more scope for working closely with Leicester City Council to try and ensure that there are complementary systems in place around that.
The very point, Chair, is that we're not working with Leicester City, so it won't work anyway, because that's the central donut where those districts who abut the city will have difficulty because the city don't want to negotiate with any of us, and if you're to join the county, I'm sure they won't negotiate with the county either. Completely insular on how they react to local issues.
Right, Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quickie on paragraphs 4 and 5 to start with. I just wondered if any thought has been given to the number and location of officers required by the new council. I asked that under economic development because, of course, with 7 large employers in the districts having central hubs, there is a large economic benefit to those areas, which could be decimated if those officers and number of staff would disappear. So we do need some sort of economic impact analysis on the effect of where offices go and the impact on local economies, shops and towns, etc. Under page 9723, the Community Infrastructure Levy, and sadly I have read all 866 pages of the CIL Act. It says there at CIL would a reduction, it would be better to go for CIL with a reduction from 7. Well, the reason districts haven't gone for CIL is because it actually attracts far less money on the per square metre place. So it's inaccurate to say we might be able to manage it effectively, but you're managing far less money. So the reason CIL is not there, and I'm sure it was a Freudian slip, Tom, but when you reference paragraph 41, you mentioned a 50% saving in planning staff. What there actually is a 50% saving in staff making local plans. And bearing in mind we're on webinar, I just thought it was worth correcting that. So that our planning officers across the county don't rush off to get employed elsewhere.
Yeah, just on the SIL, I just wondered why an assumption had been made that we would, the Unitary Authority would want to produce the SIL, because as Terry said, there's been quite a bit of work done on that by boroughs and districts over there. There was some idea about there might be a common SIL. But what we did in Harborough was, having modelled what a SIL might look like, we then took 3 planning applications and a small one, a large one and a very large site, and applied both just as an exercise to them. And in all 3 cases there would have been less income to mitigate the costs of that development from the traditional from a sill than from the traditional 106. And once that was reported to members, there was no enthusiasm for it. Why would you do that? If it makes life easier, it might make life easier for the developers, but I don't think that's what we're here to do.
I think obviously a new council would need to look at SIL and the economics and viability of introducing SIL. I think the point that's made here is that, and this is in the sort of final sentence, is that if you were to have a SIL at a unitary level, it would be more cost effective to introduce. There would be one single SIL system across the county. So that might, I think it would probably be at the margins, but that would make it more likely that you could introduce one, because it would be less expensive to introduce. But I absolutely accept the point that you would still need to assess whether it would be a viable scheme to run.
Does that answer your... Oh, yes. The location, you mean staff?
Well, where we physically have building staff located.
Yeah. Is that not a property issue generally?
Well, I think it is a property issue, but we need to be minded of the impact on parts of the county that could be affected by a new council being formed and us making decisions without due cognizance of the impact on that local economy, was where I was coming from.
Have any assumptions been made about keeping... So there would be one authority, but there would still need to be local delivery of services out of buildings. Has any assumptions been made about the retention of currently owned, managed or whatever district buildings around the county? Are we making any assumptions in the financial modelling?
My understanding, and I've just sort of checked this with Chris, is that assumptions have been made about the savings that can be made through rationalisation of the council's property assets. So there would be, that by implication means that there would be reduced services, but I don't think any detailed proposal has been put forward in terms of what that might look like. Clearly, there would be a need for services to be delivered locally as well as from, for example, County Hall, if that were to remain the headquarters. But the detail of that still needs to be designed. I think in terms of considering that, clearly the economic impact will be a consideration alongside other issues. The cost of running facilities, the business need for them. I think a question was asked at an earlier commission meeting, I think it might have been by Mr. Richardson, as to whether any economic impact analysis had been done of that, and that is something that we haven't done, and I think that's the answer that was given at that time.
Thank you, Chair. I just had hope, following my previous questions, some work might have been done on it. But on the basis, Tom, that you said some work has been done and we've got some assumptions of where those locations are, could they please be shared with this committee?
I don't think any assumptions have been made about the locations of buildings. I think some strategic assumptions have been made about the savings that could be made by rationalising the stock.
There's implicit assumptions around the fact if you've got less staff and less managers, you're going to need less office space. But what we haven't said is we're going to have an office here and an office there in terms of the detail of it. But there's an implicit assumption that there will be some property savings arising from having less staff employed.
Is there a value being put on that, Chris?
Not specific value, no. It's implicit within the figures that Declan took you through this morning with the certain assumptions around savings is implicit within those figures.
Terry? Right. It's not clear. Is that a reasonable conclusion on that? It would need more work.
It would again form part of transition and transform. I mean, some buildings are good and some are poor. I mean, I don't think the one in Loughborough is particularly attractive building because they've tried to get out of it in the past, I understand. And I think Blaby's is kind of is yours small? And I know Hinkley, Oadby Wigston is small, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't survive. I think you'd have to take them all in and look at it. And as Chris says, there will be a saving because you certainly won't need them all. But I think it would be far too early and far too prescriptive to say to you, yes, we're going to shut Blaby's down, if you know what I mean.
It wasn't that, Nick. I wasn't looking at specific offices. I was just wondering what rationale we've done, and therefore if we looked at the value of those assets, and therefore, if the land here is more valuable for housing, it might be better to relocate half of here elsewhere, because you can make more out of selling the land here. And I just wondered what work could be done on that. But there is an impact on local communities, people's jobs, local businesses, and I'm just making sure that in this we don't lose sight of the fact there are people and businesses at the end of this.
Absolutely right. Transition and transform again, Terry, and you know, as a member of the new authority, would all be involved in that. You need to look at them, see which one is best suited for which purpose, and if one has a high value for housing and another doesn't, you might well want to get rid of one for housing. But everybody who works for any authority is protected under 2P, so we don't just sack people willy-nilly. And the ones that you do, if you do need to make redundant, you have to treat them fairly and pay them the compensation for which is deserved. It's the law. A lot of people would, in the past, have voluntarily taken redundancy, but nobody's sacked with nothing. We just know, as a matter of principle, again, Terry, that one authority will be cheaper than running 8. That's the principle. But it's transition and transform. It will take a number of years to drive out the maximum possible savings, and then of course the likes of us sitting here can then choose, do we want to make savings or do we want to reintroduce services? At least we'll have the opportunity. At the moment all we've got to do here when we're here is decide where the cuts are going.
Okay, Hilary.
Thank you. Well, I'm reading this part of the paper as economic growth and development, and my point is that I do think it will be, I'm looking at paragraph 6 on page 94, a local economic development officers network meets already and things, and I'm wondering, because obviously certain boroughs or districts at the moment are having quite a lot of economic development, and I'm not including housing in this, although all of us are being affected by housing to one level or another, but particularly in the northwest and in the Charnwood area currently, there is an awful lot of redevelopment, particularly around the university and the science parks. We do enjoy, if my figures are still right, it's a month or so since, quite a low level of unemployment in this county, which is due to where we are within the country, our communication levels. But just in the last couple of years, you look what's happening, I know it's just over the border into Rushcliffe, but it will have a huge effect on the northern area of the county, is the DMRC. The number of people that are going to be employed there, but it's not that, it's the number of people that will be there every year. And you're talking about thousands going in and out. The Enterprise Park and the Charnwood campus, the university. I mean, we've got this county, the only university is in Loughborough, and that's not, the university isn't dying, it's expanding. So I think it's most important that we have a dedicated team or group to look at this. The whole county is expanding, but at the same time, we're a very rural area. We've got a huge farming and that type of industry. We want to expand the tourism, what we can offer here. I don't come from Leicestershire. I chose to live here, and I'm very proud of that. And I think that is key that we make this, because that is our economic, and that's what will provide more income besides the savings. We've got more and more people moving in, so they'll be paying taxes. We've got industry coming to join us and employment, and that's what we have to get. And that I haven't seen enough, I will read it again, enough in this part of the paper to emphasise the importance of that.
What, you mean the opportunities that it presents? Yeah. Okay.
Well, personally, I think the opportunities of one larger economic development board are beneficial. I mean, I went yesterday, you don't know, I actually went and had a meeting with K-Cuts about DNRC, and you're right, in year one there's 350 there, so there's 300 highly skilled staff, 50 ancillary staff, and that's in year one. and then it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. They're now talking about it doing private sector deals with the insurance industry. It will have a massive effect on our southern part, our bit of the county where me and you are.
But if I may Nick's point up on that, is the fact it's not only the staff that are working there, they're going to be doing tens of thousands of hours of outpatients, which means people are coming in and out maybe just for a couple of days or a day. So they're all bringing interest into that.
Economic development knows no boundaries, and it's about time we had one big strategic economic development department to deal with that. There's already soldiers, because the soldiers are already, the military, shall I say, what soldiers implies men, but the military are already there, and they're already injured military going into Loughborough University to use some of their facilities, because some minor military accidents are very similar to bad sports accidents, and it's key that Loughborough University, and they are the lead university with the DNRC, are closely involved. And of course we've got the blooming housing implications of all these people, and highly skilled people going to want to live close to where they work. So I think a larger economic development department can look at it strategically, can only be certainly helpful for the county myself.
I spent one day.
Okay, right. Any other questions or points on economic development before we move on? Thank you, Tom. Now going to look at regulatory services. Gary Connors.
Chairman, I have
Yes, I
about
realise
5
that.
minutes.
Yeah,
I'll stay for Gary, and then
Okay.
I'll have to scoot to Colville.
Okay. Right, Gary, do you want to make some introductory comments? Your services? All the services that would come in?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Page 101 provides a general outline. It's a scoping document in effect of regulatory services delivered by the County Council and the District Councils. A public protection service really is another way of defining this area of work, can be distilled into two areas. Consumer protection is one, and the other is supporting legitimate businesses. An overall objective from an enforcement perspective is to encourage economic well-being in Leicestershire and across the districts, and to protect the economic well-being of the area. So always think of enforcement as protecting businesses as well and promoting that economic growth. A single council public protection service would be better placed strategically to tackle those unfair trading practices that pose the greatest risk to the economic area. And paragraphs 5, 6, 7 and 8 provide the key opportunities in a single tier arrangement. I'll perhaps just cover some of the main points on those. Prioritisation of resources. Enforcement is about prioritisation. There is a plethora of legislation that falls to the local authority to enforce. To bring businesses into compliance or to tackle an emerging issue often involves a range of enforcement agencies. Clearly a single tier authority would allow that focus from an enforcement and supporting business perspective. There are some overlaps in terms of the enforcement functions. Perhaps one area to specify would be around food safety, food labelling and food hygiene. So officers responsible for delivering food standards controls are assessed against a food law code of practice to make sure that they've got the appropriate delegation and training to undertake food safety enforcement. Whether there is food hygiene or food description standards, and that's all encompassed within a framework. A Food Standards Agency survey of local authorities in 2018 found that over 50% of the responding authorities across England and Wales employ the services of environmental health staff in the delivery of food standards controls, and it's combined in 50% of those cases where environmental health staff are used for that same function. There are clearly a number of benefits to this approach, such as an increase in the available regulatory resource and the potential for a single food inspection covering both hygiene and food standards. That clearly reduces the inspection burden on businesses. That's what businesses are saying to us. However, it is essential that those delivering those food standards are given the appropriate training and support, and that's been started nationally across the different enforcement agencies. Perhaps a good example to use, a recent example, they've just started an apprenticeship for enforcement. So that's called a regulatory compliance officer. So that apprenticeship would fall in with a number of different agencies, from trading standards to environmental health. The County Council Service is a signatory already to a joint enforcement protocol with the district councils, particularly around food safety, and that includes such areas as durability, complaints, food alerts, allergy issues and the like. However, there are variances in approach in terms of prioritisation, and that varies across the district council. In relation to food safety, it would be more targeted from a single tier authority. A survey undertaken by the Chartered Trading Standards Institute, which is my profession, the survey identified that many of heads of regulatory services, trading standards heads, had other services under their command, including environmental health, fire and rescue, licensing, dog warden services, coroner's services and the like. So it's not an unusual scenario. A clear one around efficiencies is opportunities for income under the commercialisation agenda. Central government have released a number of codes. One currently still under review is about cutting red tape. And the Food Standards Agency have issued a policy around regulating food, and the clear direction of travel in those circumstances is to reduce the demand on business, to provide information to multiple regulators, and to target your enforcement activity in a more informed way. In other words, intelligence-led enforcement. That's far easier across the different enforcement agencies if we were to share that intelligence on a more formal basis. Another indicator and a worry is that the National Audit Report in 2016 reported that effective consumer protection relies on sufficient coverage across the local level to prevent enforcement gaps. Since 2009, nationally, there's been a 56% loss of trading standards expertise. I'm sure that that's very similar in other enforcement regimes, such as environmental health. Within the last few months, a regulatory compliance officer apprenticeship has started, and they're trying to redress that. But there is quite a lot of diversity in terms of the approach to enforcement and how much emphasis is placed upon it. Income generation is another area. There is something called the Primary Authority Scheme, which allows businesses to get assured advice from a single local authority, giving them greater confidence and saving them time and money. A single tier authority will be better placed to take part in these schemes. It does generate income. We can charge for that advice. So, for example, we are primary authority for Next, and we're also primary authority for Dunelm. With the whole range of enforcement functions, clearly that would give us much greater opportunities to set up a multidisciplined business compliance service, which can stand alone from the enforcement head, and it's very much encouraged by government. Central government are saying that businesses need to pay for the regulation, and that's the direction it's going. In the paper, there is reference to Durham and the Better Business for All partnership, and we have a similar BBFA. However, the commitment and allocation across that BBFA is varied. Clearly, a single authority would provide one voice from the regulator's perspective. There are other crossovers across the regulatory services, but I will emphasise this is a scoping document from that perspective. It's replicated elsewhere across the country. There are clear areas from an intelligence-led perspective. For example, I'll give one example relating to illicit tobacco at the minute and counterfeit tobacco. That is threatening the high street across most of the towns that we have in Leicestershire. If we are able to team on a more formal basis with environmental health, who deal with the food licensing, and very often these are food registration premises, across licensing, often they may sell alcohol, antisocial behaviour. There is an enforcement toolkit there which is far more effective when we're able to draw as a multidisciplined enforcement team to drive that problem out of the towns. That is a significant problem. It's affecting local businesses on the high street. Businesses want us to act, but they want us to act in a targeted way and to go to a one-stop shop for their business compliance. There are many other examples, but I'm conscious of the time. Rogue landlords is another area. Trading standards are being encouraged now to deal with rogue landlords and the lettings industry. There are clearly links there with the district councils and their responsibilities there under health and safety legislation. Construction products is another one, links to building control. There are many connections with it in terms of the enforcement landscape. I'll finish there, Chair, if there's any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Terry.
Just a quick one, Chairman, because I honestly don't know. Under regulatory services, is this where planning enforcement would come, or would that fall under somewhere else?
In my document, there is possibilities for it to fall within from the enforcement side of planning. It could very well do that because there are a number of skills that could be acquired in terms of the enforcement rather than the advisory side. I'll give you an example. Currently, across the districts and the county, there will be an enforcement policy published by each local authority. To draft that enforcement policy and to review that and have a single focus and consistency in terms of decisions on enforcement, that could be brought into one enforcement policy. But yes, it is possible to extend the function of that enforcement team, and some authorities have gone that direction.
The only reason I ask is, I know the big local issues to residents in my ward is obviously enforcement on gypsy and traveller sites, where frequently officers need to go out on Saturdays, Sundays, bank holidays, evenings. So it would just be nice to see something in these documents about where that would actually belong and how that service would be replicated. I appreciate you can't do it now, but just going forward.
It is fair to say that across some of the functions that perhaps do not get as involved with hard-nosed enforcement as regular, say, trading standards would, we have, I suppose, this within trading standards. We have technical officers that deal with metrology, weights and measures advice. They may not have the same skills as an investigator who are trained in a different way. So that there are lots of opportunities from an economies of scale perspective and bringing in specialised expertise to support a planning service if there is a central enforcement team. So yes, it is possible, and there could be good links there.
Thank you. Yes, you mentioned it briefly. The private rented sector does concern me. Extra number of houses being rented in the private sector. Some of the conditions aren't perhaps as good as they might be. At the minute, the district councils deal with that. So you're assuming that will come over to you two and your team?
Currently, there is some legislation on its way through Parliament which is going to require trading standards to get more involved, particularly around the deposit schemes. And the focus is that the concern is at district level whether or not they've got the right toolkit to be able to deal with the rogue landlords, because where you have a rogue landlord, you'll get other consumer protection issues that need to be dealt with. So in answer to your question, yes, that we'd be in a stronger position to deal with that kind of criminality.
Right. And the other question is, Chair, is that you mentioned part of licensing, but of course you've got taxis and hackney carriages, and you didn't mention that. You mentioned the premises, so that's quite a big item. And of course that's been They need a local base for that rather than the building here at Glenfield.
Currently, trading standards operate a licensing scheme which doesn't involve licensing committees, for example, to deal with explosives, so the registration of to sell fireworks. It can be a very similar process, albeit you need local access points. But there's absolutely no reason why a public protection service cannot encompass a licensing. In terms of Hackney carriages, in relation to licensing to sell alcohol, that's clearly done at district level and involves committees. That would just transition under, you would still have licence committees. We currently feed into that, so where we've had difficulties with age-restricted sales, for example, selling to under 18s, we will often make representations at licensing committees with a view to get a revocation, so that there is involvement there. Some of the other authorities, Birmingham City, for example, Birmingham City Trading Standards, they've been very involved with the Hackney carriage businesses in terms of dealing with unlicensed Hackney carriages and taxis. So from that perspective, from an enforcement, there are again links there.
Ted.
When you spoke about rogue landlords, the Charlborough Council is looking to, certainly in the next council year, to introduce mandatory or selective licensing, not mandatory, selective licensing of all houses in multiple occupation. In the case of a unitary authority where you've got quite a localised issue because of the Loughborough University, but then you've got the other districts and the areas in Leicestershire, I presume you would then have to introduce a similar scheme for the rest of the county to bring in some uniformity of the procedure.
Yeah, I understand the point you're making. It's fair to say at county level, the Trading Standards Service is very much intelligence-led. We have an intelligence database. We feed information in both regionally, nationally, locally. What you're talking about there is potential local issues. By being a single authority with enforcement embedded into a multidiscipline team, you're able to work with that intelligence. And to give you an example, with Loughborough, for example, we have our trading standards officers have attended freshers fairs to give advice on potentials of rogue landlords and not being caught by unfair terms in contracts and the like. So we particularly targeted the students as new people into the area, not familiar with the area, and clearly vulnerable to being taken advantage of. From an economic perspective. So I think it would be easier in a single tier authority to identify a problem, whether or not it's illicit tobacco in Colville or Hinckley, and then to put the necessary expertise in there. Very often, when we start with dealing with a rogue trader, we start with trading standards legislation. We don't necessarily resolve the problem by utilising trading standards legislation. An example being is we've just dealt with a rogue plumbing outfit. 2 directors are based in Leicestershire. They pleaded guilty to Section 993 Companies Act fraudulent trading. It started as a trading standards investigation to look at regulatory breaches, but we've ended up with a fraud case. By bringing in the teams, you're able to support legitimate businesses, deal with that problem trader holistically and tackle the problem. Of course, it's got to be receptive to local issues.
Yeah, but in terms of that's extremely useful. But given that Charnwood is very likely to introduce landlord licensing in some parts of Loughborough, the more central area of Loughborough, would a unitary authority seek to think, well, we'll have to actually implement that all through the county?
not necessarily. It is an area that we'd have to review, clearly. There are lots of changes in the legislation currently going through Parliament, and it is an area that, certainly from wearing a trading standards hat, there are other enforcement opportunities, and it's becoming a priority as the rented sector also grows. But to take the finer detail of your point, I take the point in the sense that you need to be focused to still local issues, but utilise a county resource from an intelligence perspective.
I mean, on HMOs, I know they're a particular problem in the middle of Loughborough. They're a particular problem in some other areas as well, where you don't need planning permission for a house of 5. You can just call it an HMO, and it causes grief, not so much with the residents, where they park the blooming cars, things like that. But you could have specific policies for specific areas, exactly the same as you do now, and your local committee or whatever you choose would be part of their responsibilities to look at it, same as you've got now. But I think the principle that Gary's, and I truly believe because I'm Gary's lead member, when we look at it, the advantages of combining the service are, in this particular case, quantum, in my view, just to bring everything together.
I mean, if you talk alcohol, taxi licensing, and all those things that members need to be involved in, I bet you'd be having a committee that sat every week. Just replicate what goes on at the moment, virtually, unless you did it through the area. You effectively did it at that local level. It was just part of the agenda, probably just one application to deal with. But I think that would need some further thought, how best to discharge those functions, because clearly your back office, you just join them up as you've described, but how you would actually do the decision making, and of course all those things, you tend to get people turn up and want to. So if it's some chap who wants his taxi licence, he's going to turn up and want to make the case. So someone made the point earlier about having that
there's
local.
one link to that as well. There are lots of things happening nationally in terms of being individual authorities being funded for enforcement work. So, for example, the National Ports and Borders project up at East Midlands Airport, Leicestershire Training Standards are funded nationally to provide a team to deal with unsafe products coming to East Midlands Airport. As a single tier authority with all the enforcement toolkit there, you're in a much better place to be able to put bids in to provide enforcement services both regionally and nationally. That's shown to be providing very good opportunities. If you produce a good result with one regional job, you'll get others, and essentially that's income and additional expertise.
Okay, I've got Terry Ine, and then we need to move on to property.
Chair, paragraph 5, you make a very good case for this, and I would certainly agree with Councillor Rushton. This feels like a no-brainer, because when I look at the lists of what we do and what the district does, and I realise I'm completely confused, and I would assume that they all do what they do. And I'm well aware that customer services are getting missed calls at either end. So one of the questions, certainly in line with the learning from the savings on the light bulb project, do we know roughly what savings we could make simply by reducing missed calls and handoffs? So that's one. And then the other one comes up from the comments the committee asked Councillor Bannister, who was very keen on shared services, why aren't we doing this already? And that's paragraph 6, removal of current enforcement overlaps. Why aren't we doing this already? Why can't it happen until we get a unitary authority?
Probably start with the last question in relation to shared services. We have looked at this, and we do, from a trading standards perspective, we operate as well regionally, and we do collaborate and share resources. We've gone through some formal processes. In fact, Leicestershire did look at a shared service in terms of trading standards with other counties. Between counties and district in sharing enforcement, what we find is that it can be somewhat problematic because of varying priorities and variance on the allocation of resources to enforcement. I mentioned enforcement policies earlier. That there is quite a degree of variance in terms of enforcement response. So whilst shared services do provide potentially some opportunity, clearly it doesn't hold that single focus that you would with one enforcement authority. But it's not to rule that out. In terms of the number of calls and unnecessary calls, there's no specific work on that. We do get feedback from our call centre, and in relation to the approach from businesses, I think in the example, was it Cornwall that we've used, there you can see an increase in use, but I absolutely agree. There is certainly a lot of businesses that are ringing round trying to find the right people to speak to, perhaps without mentioning the word Brexit, but I can't do it any other way. Whatever happens after today, that we already know that there's going to be a very clear push on local authorities, particularly from small, medium enterprise businesses, post-Brexit, to be supported. The big boys can look after themselves, but your local businesses will need compliance advice, whether or not that's on the changes or no changes. But it is going to change, and it's a big piece of work. And if anything, as we move forward, if we've got one local authority that covers all the enforcement regime, I call it enforcement, it's really about supporting businesses and business compliance, then it's a much easier journey for businesses. And I think that clearly is a responsibility of ours to support those legitimate businesses, and we can then concentrate on driving the bad traders out.
Just for clarification, and to come back to Councillor
Yeah.
Bannister's suggestion, you would say that we have already looked at doing this as a sort of shared service and realised it isn't going to work.
Yes, we have from a trading standards perspective. I can say that there are other authorities that have looked at shared with environmental health departments. Worcestershire is an example of that. Regrettably, that failed. I understand it was around funding decisions and the variance across the piece, across the different authorities. So it's now returned and it's broke off as a shared service. I've had some discussions with Worcestershire to find out really what was behind it all, but that's my take on it. It's quite a difficult issue to manage from a governance perspective in terms of priorities.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. That's been very illuminative. Thank you, Nick. Yep. So we're going to go on now to look at the property services. We've got John Bennett joining us from Corporate Resources. Byron Rhodes is returning to the table. So, John, do you want to introduce this section?
Yes, thank you, Chair. There are three main areas that I'd like to draw the Commission's attention to, namely asset management, capital works, and office HQ stroke locality offices. And perhaps I'll deal with these in a slightly different order than I was going to, because obviously locality offices came up in the previous section, so I think I may jump straight to that, if I may. So this is covered in paragraphs 12 to 15 on page 107. So there is duplication of the provision of office space for both frontline and back office support. And while at county level at the moment we're undertaking our own workplace strategy review to ensure the optimal use of how we operate our properties and how we operate within district council properties, there is an obvious extension of that piece of work to the districts and see how they operate within their properties. And then the corollary to that, of course, is then how would a unitary authority work within the property asset portfolio that we currently have. So whilst the work has not been extended that far, it is clear from even at county level that there is a certain amount of efficiencies that can be driven from the system, and also looking at how the properties work from a service level operation. So as well as looking at it from a property perspective, we are definitely looking at it from a service provision perspective, because there is no point in closing everything down and bringing everybody to County Hall if those services need to be on the ground in the places where they are. So by adopting the hub and spoke model, we'd ensure that there is an evidence-based rationalisation which either release buildings for sale, or alternatively we could rent them out to generate revenue for frontline services. And you would have seen the brief explanation of how Wiltshire went about their rationalisation in paragraphs 18 through to 20, where they went down from 95 buildings down to 3 hub properties that also brought in the blue light services and health, etc. If I can go back now to the asset management point, paragraphs 4 through to 8. I did hear Tom Pennell briefly relate to the investment properties, and certainly from a corporate asset investment fund where we operate a number of industrial units as well as our farm estate and now offices as well. The districts do the same thing, and it makes sense to bring all of the management of those industrial estates within one controlling team, in order that the staff can be reorganised in order to provide the best support for those properties, and also a number of districts outsource the management of their properties to external agents, and all that can be brought in with the concurrent savings. So not only would there be savings in how the combined portfolio would be run, there'll be a great opportunity to manage them more effectively as well. So centralised decision making on investment and management, and divestment if necessary. I mean, if we use an example in Colville, both the County Council and the District Council operate a number of industrial units throughout the town, and in many ways they almost compete for the same tenants, and this does not make an awful lot of sense from a public use of money. So we can look at things from a more holistic view, then we'll be able to ensure that the estate is run from a more optimal level. And obviously the operational property point with regard to services I've just referred to. So the single controlling management structure would avoid the competition and lead to more coherent decision making. With regard to the capital works on paragraphs 9 through to 11, this can be dealt with fairly swiftly. It's not a large subject, but it is one that's certainly worth considering, because at county level we've set up a programme management office to ensure that how we deal with our capital projects throughout certainly the investment portfolio, now moving into education and looking at wider transport issues, to ensure that how contracts are let for the major capital works are dealt with on the most efficient manner, so we can drive economies of scale. And for county we're doing this again. This can be rolled out to all of the capital projects that the unitary authority would be responsible for. So this would improve the project setting, cost control, delivery on time and on budgets, and so drive savings through that. Okay, that was a quick spin through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Byron.
Well, I'm happy to take the questions, but I think what John has actually outlined there is that in a unitary concept, we would have a viable property service which would be, because of the scale at which we operate, would be more efficient than the fragmented service we have at the moment. And many districts, I think, obviously have their own properties to look after, and they have one or two, maybe one or two more, in one or two cases, officers to do it. But certainly my experience previously with Melton Borough Council, you only managed to employ one, and of course if that person then is not available, you have a deficiency of service, and it's difficult to get the right level of recruitment. Whereas in a larger organisation, you can get the scale you need, and you can get the actual balance of expertise as well. And then you add to that the more efficient use of buildings by deploying people. But what we don't want to do, and I think this is the emphasis, we wouldn't want to centralise everything here. I mean, clearly with area committees, you want to have staff in the localities as well. And some of the buildings which would be available to a unitary authority out there in the market towns are very high quality buildings, and they would be very, very obviously useful for delivery of services in those communities. So whilst there has been some discussion out there in the media that, you know, sort of this particular brand new office, Parkside was mentioned in Melton, the hub in Hinckley might be shut down, you know, because everything will go to Glenfield, you know, as a bogeyman of Glenfield, as it were. I don't think that actually would be the case. I think you need an outlook somewhere to actually deliver service that people can relate to in those communities. So, and with an efficient property service, you could provide that, I think, and I think that would that will get support.
That's helpful. You know, given the number of people that have been brought onto this campus in the last sort of 5 years, and bringing in health and range of other services operate here that are not under the direct running of the county council, do we reach a capacity of how many people we can physically? I mean, I know there are car parking issues, and we've had to address those, but will we reach a point where actually it's not possible, other than building on the sports field, to accommodate any more here? I mean, you're still trying to get the fire people to leave, aren't you, so you can get that back?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm trying to push people away, but you're right. There is a pressure on this site with the facilities it's got available, and particularly car parking is an issue. I mean, there's probably we haven't put it forward yet, but there may well be a need for a multi-storey car park in order to actually use the space better on the site. But of course that would require capital investment, which would need financing. And as you know, we're very short of capital, so it's not that high on the list of priorities, but it is a problem if you want to bring more people on site. No, what's important is you make your property decisions in accordance with your operational decisions, and you try to get the property facilities made to facilitate those. You don't let one drive the other, unless of course you are forced by lack of resources to do so. But I mean, generally, of course, what our view is that the more buildings we use which are multi-occupation with multi-service, not necessarily just the county council but other services as well. For example, the health service are here in significant numbers at County Hall, and we'd very much like to have perhaps all the CCGs here we've probably got enough office space, but we actually might be under some pressure on car parking to do it. But that would be very beneficial in many ways to for the delivery of services. These are things which we would have to overcome. John might want to say a little bit more about the specific problem of County Hall.
Yes, there is a specific project ongoing with regard to car parking, which forms part of the wider workplace strategy. So we're looking at both controlling demand side as well as possibly increasing supply, as Byron said, with regard to possible multi-storey. But what we're also looking at is, use of technology. Everybody doesn't need to be here sat at a desk, but with regard to our partners, we have 500. The partners that currently occupy their desks, they raise about 500,000 a year for us. We have another 500 desks that, should we be able to solve the car parking issue, could raise another 500,000. So even if with a capital sum for a multi-storey car park, you can see that it makes financial sense to try and use this building in the most optimal manner possible, but without causing car park issues either on site or displacing them off site.
Right, Hilary.
Thank you. Could I draw your attention to page 107, and I'm really looking at paragraphs 14 and 16. That's what I should base my questions around. Number 14 is direct services to the public will be provided through reduced, fully co-located service hubs. What type of direct services would this cover? And who would make the decision of where they would go and what area it would cover? Paragraph 16, currently there's a large number of assets with duplication of functions, e.g. depots for vehicle storage and waste collection and recycling. And obviously there'll be maintenance, people for housing, for social housing and buildings and everything. That I think needs to be looked at very carefully before you get rid of them all, because Leicestershire is not a small county. And if somewhere in the north of the county has got their own depots for vehicles for this type of work, and Market Harbour have as well, or Lutterworth, you don't want to close one because the savings have gone, because you've got vehicles travelling up and down road. We had this problem, if you remember, when waste vehicles were going out of county. It reduces the service for the customers. And this whole idea, besides saving the council money, as far as I can see it, and improving services. We certainly don't want to lessen services to our public. They're the ones that are paying everybody's wages, allowances, etc. With the multi-use of property, I think Councillor Rhodes has already indicated it. For example, I come from the Charnwood area, so in our council offices, besides the council offices, we also have the DWP, the police, the registry office, the coroner's court. And that's before you start on anybody else using the premises for their meetings as well, and our meeting room, which is used by multitudinous people in the old courtroom. So there's my question. What type of direct services would be provided, and is it being looked at when you get rid of for the duplication of locations, that you're not making a more expense out of a different budget to keep those services running? Thank you.
I think you need to look at it in the context of providing a better service. Having more functions on a site, and in some locations around the county, we've got a better mix of functions on a particular delivery site than in others. Means that they get to know each other and provide a more comprehensive service to the public. And all the time you've got to look at it from the perspective of, right, a member of the public comes in, needs some assistance with some issue in their lives. Being able to have that issue dealt with there and then, because all the people who have the special skills to help them are available, is clearly better than being to say, well, I'm sorry, I can't see you there. You need to go down the road and talk to the people down there, or over to somewhere else and talk to them. And you don't get that integration. So where we have been able to achieve it, and there's one or two locations where that has been done, but most of them it hasn't been done in total, although there is an eclectic mix almost of functions. I mean, you've mentioned what's at Southfields, but that's a different mix to those which are at Melton or to the hub in Hinckley or in the Adam and Eve Street in Market Harbour, for example. And the same, and of course also there's an issue about delivery of services in Oby Wigston as well, and I've had discussions with Mr. Bolter in the past about how we could improve those. We'd have the opportunity to do that, and I think that's something which I think would would actually mean that a unitary council would actually greatly improve the services, particularly to people to most vulnerable and need help. As far as the deployment of back office, I say back office or back facilities of a specialist nature for things, I'll let Mr. Bennett answer that. I think he probably better qualified than me.
Well, just to continue that point on, that where we have no need for public-facing services, then we've got greater flexibility in being able to deploy people into the most efficient buildings. I mean, some of the buildings, may be old, maybe in the wrong place, and so we can look more holistically to where the spatial arrangement of where everything is and where do people need to be. There are some places where, as Byron mentioned, people need to be. Maybe they're paying cash over. Maybe they're getting support that they need face to face. Other things can be set away. So if we can just look to provide the services in the right place and at the most optimal cost, then we should. With regard to the points with regard to the waste recycling, etc. I mean, you'll see that's only 2.5 lines, and it's only because that we're raising it as at something that should be looked at, and I'm dealing with a relocation of a waste transfer facility at the moment, so well aware of the trade-offs that you have with moving it from an optimal place to somewhere else with, okay, it may be a cheaper location, but the increase in transport costs need to be taken into account, and what is the impact on the services. So we won't do anything to any property without fully understanding all of the ramifications of that.
I take the point, and thank you very much to both the officer and the councillor there, but I still wonder what direct service to the what type of direct services are you looking at? I mean, direct services, what I would consider a direct service, might not be what Brenda would consider a direct service. So I think that would be helpful to have some idea. You mentioned face-to-face. Well, yes, that's sort of very opposite. I think it would also be interesting to see when we're deciding this later on, when you're going further down the line, when we're getting to this part of actually looking at the use of buildings, and I know most councils keep a record of this, is how many people come in for face-to-face advice, which may include, as Councillor Rhodes indicated, they may come in with a problem for, say, housing, but they've also got a problem with antisocial behaviour, another problem with revs and benefits. Now, at the moment, a lot of that can be dealt with one meeting, one building, and that's it, and one time. Now, so I think we still have to maintain at the very last, for unitary, the person that's most important in this is our residents, and I think, and economics, yes, but certain things you have to do, even though they're not economic, for the welfare of your residents.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Make just a brief reply. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And indeed, I can think of a location and an example where you have a vulnerable person who might come for help because they haven't got a job and they haven't got any money. They might actually turn up at a job centre plus to begin with. That's possibly not in the building at the moment, although it is in the one in Melton. And the officer that sees them and provides whatever assistance they can realise that they've also got a housing problem. Also realise they might actually have a health problem as well. They're also possibly vulnerable through issues which might interest the police, not necessarily their wrongdoing, but others doing it to them. So the more services that you can combine together, or connections to those services in any location, it's clearly that's a big improvement, and you can achieve a great deal by doing that. I think that has to be our central objective in proceeding to this new model.
Terry Richardson.
Thank you, Chairman. I think one of the things about we've been talking today about bigger is better, and I think there are a couple of instances that would disprove that theory. The National Health Service being the main one, and Birmingham City Council being the second. But as organisations get bigger, one of the issues they have is that decisions tend to get made in silos. Now, this report has been written quite understandably and quite rightly from the view of how we could rationalise properties and save money. But there's no reference in here to the economic well-being of the county. There's no evidence in here about the economic needs assessment that we might want to make. There's an assumption in paragraph 13 that most of the services will be provided on this campus. Now, I would have thought that probably one of the most valuable assets that this council has is this campus. Particularly in terms of housing, particularly on the edge of the city. We have a large unmet need in the city, as confirmed by the SGP. So this actually could be a perfect location to actually put all those houses and to move some of the services the new council would provide to more economically deprived areas, benefiting their local economies. But we don't seem to have considered that and put it in. And my concern is that we're looking at this in isolation. This appendix should have been written in accordance with appendix, whatever it was, F, about the economic well-being in the area and where we can put things, and it doesn't seem to have done. So how do we ensure that decisions are not made in silos? And even in my short time in the county, I've already seen examples of that, which may get worse if we get bigger. And how do we make sure it actually links back in to providing quality services to the public? And just as a sheer point of fact, on paragraph 19, how many buildings have we actually got now? It says we've gone from 95 to 3 hubs, but I'd like to know, if we're saying 95 buildings, it should say how many buildings we've now got as opposed to 95 central. Oh, is that Wiltshire? Oh, apologies for that then. So how many buildings have we currently got then as county council?
Well, if you, do you want that answering first, and then I'll come on to
whichever suits you, Byron.
Okay, we currently operate from 14 offices. There were, before I started, over 40. I think maybe even 50 at one time. But we've been through a rationalisation already to this point to 14.
Yeah, taking the other issues you mentioned about using this site efficiently. I suppose if we hadn't got this site, we might say, well, it might be a very good housing site, I'm sure it would be, but we have a very considerable building on this site, well, buildings, and a huge investment. And as you know, over recent years, we've upgraded that investment to bring it up to the 21st century standards. Therefore, the cost of dismantling it and moving to others would be quite phenomenal. But all future decisions on where you actually deploy your specialist skills, and very often you have to bring your specialist skills together to make them more efficient and effective, I think is determined really by the long-term future of this building. It's now 50 years old, but it's probably got quite a few years left in it still, especially with the upgrading that we've done in recent years, compared with what the opportunities would be elsewhere. Only a single council could take a decision like that, because it would have the full flexibility of using all the property services available to local government throughout the county.
Thank you, Chair. I was interested in your point about the land in Colville, which I think was well made about competing across county district. I'm also aware that there are opportunities to work together more efficiently. For example, again, back in good old Colville, we're redeveloping Snibston, which is banked up next to the Colville football ground, which is owned by North West Leicestershire District Council. And when I'm seeing some conversations at last between the two organisations, it would be nice to see more of that. But this has also brought me to the thought that nowhere in your document have you mentioned leisure services, which, if unitary status went ahead, we would presumably inherit, certainly in my own patch, a brand new, about to be built leisure centre, complete with £20 million worth of debt to go with it. So one of the questions that I think we need to address is what would we do about leisure, and how would we, in whatever we did, balance the need to manage our capital efficiently, manage those services that are in those buildings efficiently, and also achieve a level of local control, and also what opportunities might there be there for rationalising our customer-facing infrastructure.
I mean, Vision Data Services is a service which is provided principally by the districts and boroughs now at the moment. But it's a very variable service when you look across the county. In a rich area like the one where you live in northwest Leicestershire, which the council certainly is, because it's had so much economic development over recent years, and there's the revenues from both council tax and business rates are considerably more than they used to be. And indeed, in fact, it's probably now generates more than any other council area in Leicestershire. I can see why now there's a move towards building a new leisure centre, because the council can afford it. It may actually be deciding, for reasons of its own, to borrow the money to do it. Well, as you know, I'm not a person that believes in borrowing money, but that's a matter of decision at the moment. It's North West Leicestershire District Council decision. Elsewhere in the county, I know of areas where they would give their IT to have the resources to be able to build a leisure centre, and indeed I know one area that's struggling to develop facility they've already got and don't have the resources. The Unitary Authority, of course, will take a broader view. And I think it's also fair to say that matters like this now, just as other things that we've learned from the scrutiny process and the discussions that we've had, I think are matters now that we now have the opportunity, when we move towards the business planning exercise, to develop more fully, and indeed to provide a much improved offer, as it were, of what the future Unitary Council might look like and what it might be able to achieve, particularly, of course, with its improved revenues that would come from existing, and from the pooling of revenues that we've talked about as well.
Okay, I'm going to call this section to a halt. I think we've given it property a good airing, got an understanding of the issues involved. Can we move? Thank you very much, John. Can we move on to the last section here on revenue collection? Chris.
Yeah. I'm going to be pretty brief, to be honest, because we covered quite a bit of this morning when we were talking about some of the efficiencies around services. So the benefits around revenue collection, which is principally council tax and business rates, that there's the obvious one around kind of operational efficiency, combining 8 sections into one, economies of scale, which I'm not going to cover. But I'll just talk about, I suppose, some of the less obvious kind of benefits of combining it. I think most people are familiar around business rates, around the 80-20 split between districts and county councils. So, in fact, 80% of the business rates goes to districts, 20% to the county council. The 80% goes to districts because of the incentive around planning. The issue with that is that a lot of the costs around infrastructure, around development, actually fall on the county council. So you have this funny kind of split with the money going to the district, but not to the county where it needs to be spent. And that does actually throw up some kind of issues in terms of, are the right decisions being made locally on the ground? Is the money going to the right place? Can the infrastructures be built? And so by combining together into Unitary, you kind of solve that issue. The other issue around the 80-20 split is there's an awful lot of time, and I know this through experience, there's an awful lot of time spent talking to district councils, maybe around business rate pilot, maybe around the business rate pool, in terms of how the split of this money is going to be used. And again, I mean, we were talking at SCG this morning around the enterprise zone and again, the split of business rates. So there's an awful lot of time and effort goes into that, when what we should really be focusing is it's kind of where that money should be spent to get the best benefit for the people of Leicestershire. So there's a kind of operational issue there. The final thing around the strategic bit is you can grant discretionary reliefs around business rates. And I think because those discretionary reliefs are granted at a local level, we don't take a strategic view in terms of maybe we want to incentivise business locations in certain parts of Leicestershire, maybe we want to incentivise certain types of businesses. And I think if we operated at a kind of a more strategic level, county level, we would be looking at those discretionary reliefs and maybe looking at them more within the eye around economic development and what the best kind of release the grant and to who. But at the moment, we don't really do that within Leicestershire at all. So I'm going to stop there in terms of an introduction. There's a bit more detail around council tax in the papers.
Terry Richardson.
I might as well go for a full house. It's only a very quick one, Chris. I understand what you're saying here about revenue collection. Most councils now operate a combined revenue and benefits section, but there's nothing in here about the delivery of benefits and how that will be delivered. So I just wonder if there's anything you'd like to comment on about benefits and how we deliver those services, particularly with the reduction in the rollout of universal credit. There's going to be more and more people still going into local offices of whatever council for help on benefits going forward, and the linkage with revenue actually is almost key, particularly where you're looking at things like council tax, etc.
When we produced this paper, clearly we were looking at the previous timetable around universal credit. So we took the assumption that it was going to be rolled into universal credit. So we haven't actually commented around the benefit side of it.
Yeah, but we would still have to operate the council tax reduction scheme, wouldn't we? Which is a benefit. That has a significant amount of admin, ability to appeal, and so on and so forth. So have you taken that into account?
You are, in terms of the discretionary discount scheme around council tax would have to be operated within the unitary government. I mean, it's a similar kind of, I suppose, in terms of some of the advantages of bringing that together, is there's an awful lot of time in it. I think there's 7 different discretionary discount schemes operating across Leicestershire. And if you looked at it strategically and looked at it in line with maybe some of the more social goals we wanted, you could probably look at that in quite a different way as well, and look at how you wanted to incentivise certain behaviours. And we were involved when it first came in, and we ended up with 7 different schemes, which probably makes it quite difficult for the residents of Leicestershire in terms of navigating their way around it.
Move on.
Any other questions on revenues or benefits? No. Right, thank you very much. We've covered that. Can we change the table then? And I think we've got Gordon McFarlane and Lauren Haslam, Director of Corporate Services. Corporate Governance, isn't it? Governance and Legal. Now, we've just got you down for a verbal report. We haven't got any papers, but members have asked a number of questions today about essentially the process that would go through. Let's just assume that this has happened and that it's a unitary county and that the Minister has given it approval and it's gone through its parliamentary processes. This is all hypothetical. But what we're after understanding is the process then by which there'll be a group of people, this is based on previous discussions, who essentially will be doing exactly the same job in the authority, and we would expect them to automatically transfer under 2P regulations. Then there'll be people like chief officers and so on, and deputy chief officers that are appointed, there's member involvement in their appointment, and as we understand it, all those posts would be up for there'd be no assumptions. All those posts would be up for competitive process in order to fill them once the structure had been agreed. But then we keep talking about how we get these efficiencies. So by the fact we were a unitary, we wouldn't need so many people, and so on and so forth. And then there were a group of people that, they actually do exist at both levels. So there are some planners and lawyers and those sorts of people who again, maybe we wouldn't automatically need them all. So what we're after understanding is the processes that we would go through in order to arrive at a structure. for the new authority. Is that about some of what we've been asking? Okay.
Okay, if I just run through sort of what I think we know at the moment. Obviously, at the moment, we're currently relying on the regulations from 2008. That's all we've got. So the local government structural boundary changes, staffing regulations, and there's associated guidance with those. And clearly, those may be updated, and if they are, there'll be subsequent advice and guidance. In terms of, just to actually touch on senior posts first, the statutory post of head of paid service has to be subject to open competition. That's what the regs and the guidance says. And the way it's worded is councils are encouraged to follow the same approach with other senior roles. So it's very much the government saying this is a new council, and senior roles should be in open competition, if you like, but it's the role of head of paid service which has to be. In terms of the other posts, our view is that TUPE will apply to all other posts transferring into the new council, and as you know, the TUPE regulations which provide employment protection will apply equally across all organisations. So it's effectively the transfer of functions from a predecessor council to a single tier council, and that would apply equally across all 8 councils. I think there's some important principles to follow as we're creating a new council. It's incumbent on us, I think, to give as much assurance as possible around employment and terms and conditions, and as much equality of opportunity as we can to existing employees across all councils. And clearly, we'll want to manage the cost and the extent of reductions and associated redundancies as well, which kind of touches on the point that was made earlier. I think there's a number of other points to consider. You rightly say some services will be unique and will be largely unaffected. So although they will TUPE transfer, they would effectively lift and drop into the new council, although they will be protected through TUPE. There'll be many areas where we need to seek to retain specialist and technical skills, but you're absolutely right. Some of those areas, there may be what you might class as duplicate or too many roles. I'll come to that in a second. And I think another really important point is the new council will need to function effectively from day one. So we need to think, in advance about structural solutions and allowing the council and services to continue to operate from vesting day. So therefore, if possible, structures should be developed ahead of vesting day. And some posts, I imagine it won't be all, but some posts either appointed to ahead of vesting day, or staff certainly having certainty of knowing what they're moving into. So, an individual letter saying you are TUPE transferring across, and this is the area and the post that you've been moving into. In terms of efficiencies and reduction, and that covers, I think, the second 2 points that you raised, it's clear that there will be a need to make redundancies, whether those are voluntary redundancies or whether they end up as a result of organisational change being compulsory. But a view would be that each existing council would need to seek to agree some form of joint protocol, and we'll need protocols across the councils for a whole range of staffing measures, if you like, but agree a joint protocol for how redundancies are handled. So, for example, seeking volunteers from targeted areas where we know reductions would be needed from, rather than an uncontrolled open invitation across all councils, which could be fairly chaotic. And any such protocol would need to set out the redundancy terms to be used. I think, again, it's in the staffing guidance, but redundancies would normally happen after vesting day, so people would TUPE transfer across, and then the redundancies would take effect. But the councils could seek, again, jointly across all 8, to put in place a voluntary early redundancy scheme, could be called a range of things, where decisions were made in advance of vesting day and staff leave early. So that there are options, and I think those very broad points hopefully deal with the fact that yes, there would need to be efficiencies, and we would look to agree those efficiencies through new structures and revised structures. and where there are, again, duplicate roles or too many of similar roles, we would be looking to consolidate into new services, and restructuring, use redundancy provisions where it's relevant to do that. So hopefully that gives a broad brush picture, plus deals with the initial points that you've raised. I don't know if Lauren, you wanted to add anything?
Just briefly to add that Mr McFarlane and I have approached this by reviewing the guidance that was issued in 2008. What we don't have available to us is anything that was been issued more recently in connection with the Dorset and Buckinghamshire changes. So obviously we will be keeping that under review, and if anything comes out of that that is different to the 2008 position, of course we will bring that to members' attention, as that would be an appropriate thing that the members would be alerted to. But as this is just a sort of crystallisation really of a position that was reached in relation to the reviews that took place at that time, and I think is probably the best information that we have available to us to inform the current thinking.
Do you need more information? Questions? David Bill.
Going to be an appeals procedure in place. I ask this because I have very uncomfortable memories of when we started to close down departments in 1990, 1991, 92. Members were asked to come in on appeals, and it was a most uncomfortable situation to see people after people coming through the door appealing to retain their jobs, people who we'd worked with for years, and having to dismiss most of them. Will members be involved in this, or will this be a sort of internal an internal process not involving members?
I think there's perhaps two parts to the answer. There's I certainly worked in an authority in 2008-9 that disaggregated, the county disaggregated, and two unitaries were created, and we had disaggregation appeals, if you like. That wouldn't be relevant in creating a single council. What would be relevant, which I think is what you're referring to, is redundancy appeals. So, and we have that process at the moment in our organisational change policy. Obviously, if you're dealing with larger numbers, it becomes, more difficult in a way. But I think we would look to, and all authorities would, to run fair processes, to seek volunteers where we can. If we have to make compulsory redundancies through organisational change, of course we would do that, and people would be entitled to a redundancy and appeal. That appeal, from memory, is heard by officers rather than members. But that may not be the same in each authority. So again, we would need a protocol for agreeing, moving into the new council, how redundancy appeals would be managed.
Terry Richardson, why?
Hey, I might as well go for a full house, all sections. Just a very couple of quick ones. Does the announcement last Thursday or Friday, where the government are actually putting through legislation to protect local government staff's pensions, should they be 2P'd or should they move out into other jobs, have any financial impact on an authority becoming a unitary authority in due course? So is there something in that legislation that has got a cost impact that we don't know about now? And that was announced in the SIPFA document on Thursday or Friday. And secondly, the second question is that we know from the presentation we have from Baroness Scott from Wiltshire that they have decided to have no head of paid service, and effectively she as leader of council now undertakes that role. Do we happen to know how many unitary authorities have no head of paid service, and where that role has almost become a sort of quasi-mayoral office by the leader of the council? And presumably there's nothing to stop us here making that decision if we felt it appropriate.
I think in terms of the first point around pension protection, I think that the analysis of that decision still needs to be made. The only point I can make is that because we're talking about local government reorganisation, everybody who's in a pension scheme would be in the LGPS. So in terms of GP transfer people already in the LGPS. It'd be very small numbers in other schemes.
Is there an ongoing liability should anyone be made redundant? That's what wasn't clear from what I read.
Yeah, we'd need to look at the specifics in that, but in terms of if we're making redundancies and people are entitled to their pension, that works in exactly the same way. That would work in exactly the same way as it does now. In terms of any pension strain that's payable, people if they're made compulsory redundant, they're entitled to their full pension at that point, and there's a pension strain that goes with that. So that I don't think will change, but we can certainly look at the guidance. In terms of other unitaries without a chief exec as head of paid service, we'd have to look at that and come back and provide that information offline.
To clarify, it's not, you have to have a head of paid service, don't you? But you don't have to have a chief executive. So effectively, you could have a chief operating officer, or just give that post to one of the other chief officers. That's the procedure, isn't it? You do have to have a head of paid service by law, the same as you have to have a monitoring officer. Yeah. Section 151.
Number of statutory roles, but it's not a statutory post.
Yeah. What you'd say, just to clarify, the government advice is you only have to have a competitive process by law for chief exec, head of paid service, but it's advisory to do it for all those statutory posts. Now, would that be ring-fenced to existing chief officers in the new, that were in the 7 districts and the county? Or when you say competitive process, would that be a nationwide advert process?
I think the guidance around the head of paid service would be open competition means national competition. The encouragement would be to do the same for, let's say, directors, and it could be other posts as well. And I think from my understanding of what happened last time, 2009, that the majority, if not all, authorities adopted that process. Clearly, in terms of how we structure and what the posts in the new council look like, we would need to again have an agreement, because there's an impact on existing, senior managers and their rights. So we'd have to work that through. But the intent, I think, behind the government statement is that we to encourage authorities to look at open competition.
Okay, glad to clarify that. Ted Parton.
When we talk about we would save money because we would, for example, we would only need 1 head of landlord services rather than 7 currently. But who or what mechanism would decide, well, say for that role, or community safety manager, head of neighbourhoods, anything like that, who would decide, well, but it's too big an area just to have 1 person managing that. So in the case of that role, we wouldn't just have 1. So there may be, if the 7 heads of landlord services, say for example, wanted to stay on in a role, that 2 would be retained rather than just 1. What's the mechanism for deciding? Because it can be tempting to think, well, we'll just have one of those rather than 7. But at some point, there's got to be, well, that is a very responsible, big job. It's 1 person, or is it 1 person with 3 assistants? How does all that mechanics work out?
I think this comes back to how much advanced planning we can do ahead of vesting day. And I think kind of winding forward, it will be really important that senior officers across all 8 councils agree how they're going to work on structural proposals, and those structural proposals would inevitably take into account costs and savings, but also viability of services. And that's the point I was trying to make earlier around it's going to be really important that the authority is able to function effectively from day one. But those structural proposals, I would have thought, would then go to members through the implementation executive so that costed structures are signed off and are tested out in the way that you're talking about before they're finally agreed, and we play that through how that matches, you know, staff, future structures, TUPE transfers, etc. So there needs to be an officer-run member sign-off process of structures before we get to that point.
Yeah, I could imagine that there'll be some difficulty with that, wouldn't there? Because there could be, I mean, each area, I should imagine, is going to say, well, you know, we need a dedicated member of staff for this area, and almost try and retain the current model. There has to be, at some point, someone saying, but we can't have that. And where does that decision lie?
I think in some ways, if we go back to the point around kind of doing this in order and appointing to the senior structure, you then, for example, if you're able to appoint, and it may not be possible, but able to appoint directors before vesting day, you have directors empowered to then build their new functions and their new services. So that may help. Yeah, if we can do that in an ordered way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we heard earlier on that there was a key difference in some of the previous ones as to whether there was effectively a shadow authority elected a year, 12 months before vesting day, or the other model which had been done was that there was some kind of executive created from all the councils that were being got rid of, and those people took those decisions, which seemed to me to be a very strange way of going about it, because those people might not be there, they might not be on the new authority, they might not stand, they might retire, they might lose an election. The other model was the shadow authority, and all the things you've been talking about, the advantages of doing those, could be done by that shadow authority. Those chief officers could be in post months before and getting on with putting together their structure and appointing people. So, Lauren, is that a choice through the process, or is that something that the Secretary of State would decide?
I'm not sure, so I know the answer to that off the top of my head, I'm afraid. I'd have to do some research and come back to you on that point.
We're going to be doing a report, so it would be helpful to just to define whether that is something we can say to the Cabinet. Look, if you were to go ahead with this, actually, that model of having a shadow would seem to be much more chance of being able to get these things sorted in advance than the other one, which just a group of people that might not be around later to see it through. Do you have a view about that, Byron?
Well, I think there'd obviously be a shadow authority or interim authority created, which would be responsible for implementing the decision, and that clearly would have to be composed of the elected members available at that time, and indeed there would be a question of when they went out of office and the new members were elected, but clearly preparation work would have to be done, and so it would be a combination of them and the senior officers, directors that they appointed to take the appropriate decisions. I think that's something we will no doubt address in the business plan. I come to it now because the business plan is going to contain a lot more detail than we've had in these early proposals.
Bill Bolter.
Yes, Chair, we keep hearing about the amount of money we're going to save. The only way you're going to save any of that sort of money is by a great number of staff reductions. I think everybody agrees there's got to be a great number of staff reductions to achieve those savings. The question is, how equal is that going to be? Different councils employ different methods of paying staff. I think Hayes used here to establish pay levels. Other councils use other methods. And also the county council tend to pay more for a set level of staff. So I think the interest is for all the districts in particular is will they put a disadvantage on staff recruitment over the county council employees? Because I know we keep saying it's going to be a new council, but everything seems to be based on the county council, and that's what concerns me. It's not based on a new council. It's sort of the county council absorbing the other areas. So I don't know how many staff you're thinking about having to remove, but I imagine it's several hundred, if not 1,000, to achieve the savings you need to save. And what assurance are you going to give to these staff that there will be some positions for them at the end of the day? I mean, some positions, I assume, will move straight over. Districts don't have highway officers, so I imagine highway will be moved over anyway, because that's straightforward. Social services, districts don't have social services, and that will be moved over. But things like legal services, planning, environmental health, housing, various other things are up for grabs. And so they're the areas you're going to be concentrating on making savings. So we need to know we've got a level playing field for all people to apply for, because I should imagine 2/3 of them won't get a job at the end of the day.
I don't think we're into 2/3. Well, no, I mean, you're quite right, there would be substantial savings, but we're talking about 30 million being the ultimate savings, which would amount to something like about 5% of the totality, a little bit less than that, of the total spend of the combined authorities, which would be the new council. So we're not into 2/3, we're into some numbers, yes. I mean, clearly the main decision making is going to be by those who form the transitional authority, if you could call it that, the interim arrangements, and who appoint the new interim chief executive and directors who basically have to do quite a lot of the early work. And then, of course, when you bring it in, you bring it together. But don't forget, one of the things we've learned from the scrutiny process, and we learned it particularly from Jane Scott, is there's great merit in bringing everything together, but not doing the transformation straight away, but making sure everything works, and then start to move towards integrating the services and to bringing about different ways of working. So it's all about how the programme is put together to implement the decision and to eventually get to where the new authority would want to be. And clearly, at some point in that process, as a new authority is elected, and members of that authority, of course, if the pattern is followed in Wiltshire and in Durham, it would be probably about fewer than 50%, perhaps, would be existing county councillors who might want to continue as unitary councillors, probably a similar number of previous district councillors who might want to become unitary councillors, and a high proportion of people who have never been a councillor before. That certainly was what happened in those other councils, and I think that probably would be the pattern here as well. And then, of course, at the point where they were elected, they would then take what they got and then develop it from there.
Yeah, perhaps just to come back to the point around different grade differentials and grading, and perhaps pay as well. I think it's going to be really important that we treat staff equally and fairly, in terms of people having equal rights. This is 8 councils going into one, and again, I talked earlier about a protocol. We would need to agree something. So if you take the HR functions across 8 councils, the trade union representatives across 8 councils, and agree how the organisational change process was going to run. So as we're going through the process I was describing earlier around creating new structures, or of getting to the point of agreeing redundancies, an agreed way of running an organisational change process, including how we assess roles which are seen as similar, perhaps are paid differently, just because of the historical differences, and how those match against new structures. So we'd have to go through all of that, and come up with a fair way that satisfied. I'll talk about HR and trade unions as a good example, representing their members, that satisfied, any test of the criteria, if you like.
Okay, you mentioned.
Have we got any idea of numbers at all? How many members of staff we need to have a new unitary authority at the end of the day? I'm talking about the beginning, because that's fine. You'll smooth it over at the beginning, then 3 or 4 years down the line, the cuts will start, and then we're into another business.
No figures. Okay.
I don't think that question can be answered at this stage.
No, because it depends on so many factors. Okay, you mentioned the trade unions. Has there been any discussion that you're aware of about this proposal by the trade unions? We did at one time think about asking them, but we just haven't had enough time. So, have you received any representation?
We've done a couple of informal briefings with trade unions, recognising it's it's very early days, and we're committed to giving them ongoing briefings at points in time when there's developments. And clearly it's worth, from their perspective, starting to think about some of the issues that we've discussed, because when we get into it, the advanced planning will be really important. Those early joint agreements, if you like.
Can I just add to that? The fact that this would be a TUPE transfer in the end automatically engages the trade unions in participative and consultative rights that the employees affected would have through the trade union.
Right, assuming there's no other questions on HR, we're all happy with that. Thank you very much, Gordon. Thank you, Lauren. If you could just let us, through Rosemary, clarify that point on the choice, whether it's a local choice about how you set it up, or whether in fact that's decided by government.
I suspect it's not a matter of choice, but I will come back to you to confirm.
Okay. Right, so just moving on to the final part before we wrap up. The purpose of this 7 was really to invite the chairs of scrutiny committees as to whether they felt there were any issues or comments that had come up when your relevant committees had considered this paper, which I appreciate is some time ago now, or whether there's anything that you think requires further work or was a major issue that needs to be flagged up. So, and I appreciate we haven't got the chair of E&T, but we do have 2 members of E&T at least here who may want to comment on E&T. But let's start with health. Kevin, anything on you're perhaps the least affected?
No, well, to a degree. The reason I'm flicking through my pages, I'm just trying to find one of the tables we had this morning in finance, because that showed, quite surprising to me, that 2 of the districts, Harborough was one of them, I think the other one might be Blaby, have a certain amount of health. Just why is that? I mean, I didn't ask a question, I thought I'd do it at health scrutiny. But we're talking nearly £1 million a year, health between the 2, yeah. And I don't know what they do. Now, I thought that was quite interesting. That didn't come up at all in our scrutiny. It only came up today when I looked through the papers.
Is it not that they just badged some spending under a heading that's health related?
It's under public health. Whether it's drug, I mean, there may be whole bits that might get fed into public health.
Right. Okay.
But I think, other than that, yes, I mean, essentially, depending on what clearly the latest murmurings from government are, and where public health eventually lies, because it may be moving back to health.
Really? Oh, okay.
But that all has come out since our meeting.
Right.
But no,
Okay.
apart from that, yes, you're quite right.
Okay. Right. Let's do adults then. Terry.
Thank you, Chair. As you might imagine, most of adults' communities is stuff done by county and will continue to be done in whatever authority as a major service. So most of what we look at and scrutinise is on that basis. I suppose the areas which did come up really are those areas which are currently not done by a unitary authority, the ones that we've already recognised today we need to look at, such as leisure, open spaces, parks and playgrounds, all of those sort of things, which I don't know if they will come into. Some of those will go, I suspect, into assets. Some, like leisure, I suspect might go into adults' communities, but I don't know. So, you know, I think it's those services which are done. And also to echo what Kevin said, that you know, you've got things like heart sense and all those sort of things which are done through leisure centres, which may go back to health but have got to be done somewhere. You've got the doctor's referrals, the use of gyms and all those sort of things. So there is involvement across the council spectrum in health, children's service, adult service, but predominantly in adult services we're looking at, you know, rehabilitating people, getting them fitter, those sort of things, may be something that comes into a unitary authority under one heading. So most of the things we could discuss, we couldn't discuss because we don't have any information on, if that makes sense. So they're the ones currently done in the districts, which would be absorbed into a new unitary.
Thanks for that. Children and families. Brenda.
Thank you, Chair. I think really virtually the same as the adults. There's an awful lot of satellite services around the Shire, as in Front Door, Leicestershire Families. It's overspent already. So any savings that can be realised can only be good for this particular service. We've already lost children's centres, some of the children's centres, and this sort of collaboration coming together may save the rest of the children's services there. So at the moment, I think it's, I think somebody said earlier, a no-brainer for children's and families, because the services already service the whole of the Shire. And that's it. Thank you.
Appreciate we haven't got Alan Pearson here, but does anybody who was there at E&T when E&T was discussed? I think there are implications for E&T because presumably it would take on the waste function. Would be integrated. Have we got anyone who can help us on what services would come into E&T as presently planned? Can you help us with that, Simon?
I wasn't fully listening, Chair.
Right. So we haven't. Our chair of E&T isn't here, and the purpose is when each committee discussed what the implications were of a unitary authority, we wanted to just make sure that we covered off all those areas where services that are currently with districts will be combined in a current arrangement. Don't want to say the county council because it will be a new council. So we know that waste is likely would come in and would be run as a unified service, collection service and disposal service. Or are there any other areas that you think would be unified in a environment transport department?
Waste is the most obvious area where the Thank you, Chair. So waste and the consolidation of the waste collection services is the most significant part of the E&T discussion, but I suspect there will be other services that district provide around street cleansing and other environmental areas that would come together to make a more consolidated single service.
And from a member perspective, does anybody want to comment on what the discussion that took place and any key issues that came out of that, of how it would operate? David, do you want to start?
Well, just the matter I referred to this morning is referred to here under 12, little 12, Roman 12. A member, well, that was me. And I can only repeat what I said this morning, and I said on this occasion that it's the governance issue of planning, which is to me, of major concern. We talk here about major transport infrastructure being decided by at a national level, but it is also major planning issues in general, and the lack of influence that members any longer have over these issues. I mean, a few years ago, many years ago, we had many discussions over the airport and whether it should be expanded and so on and so forth. And I can remember you, Chairman, you were very involved with this. We got very closely involved with flight paths and the impact this was having on communities, and we did reach. We took account of local opinion, and I think we probably reached a reasonably satisfactory result. But now, under the new arrangements, anything to do with the airport or anything of that nature would not be decided in this county at all. The decision would be taken in Whitehall or Bristol. And it's a further example of the deterioration of the ability of councillors at all levels to properly represent the people who elect us. And I try to bring that out under 12, and I would like to see that emphasised again if possible. I can see Rosita signalling there. Magna Park, you see, Magna Park is another example. I don't know how much influence you actually had in the end in Harbour, but in the end, something of that nature won't be decided in Lutterworth or Market Harborough or County Hall. Or it will be decided in London. And that has to be brought out as we look towards new planning structures. We have to look at what is wrong with the system, the current system, how it's going wrong, and how to try to make sure that we try to at least address the issue.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I don't know what we can do about that in this report that we're now tasked with producing. Yeah, Bill.
Yes, I remember the meeting quite well, actually, but I must say some of the minutes of the meeting I find difficult to remember some of these conclusions we came to down here. In particular, one about grass cutting, one of our favourite subjects. And it says here the County Council was praised for its comprehensive records. It wasn't, Chair. It was criticised because it got no records.
Apparently it was Max Hunt.
Well, I don't know if... my comments also recorded them, Rosemary, that I said that they've got no records. Because it should be. Because County have got no records about grass cutting over in Wixton or Blaby, in that fact, because they're missing bits out this year, but that's another story. So that's the first bit. We did talk also about parking enforcement there, and it was stated that there would be a universal parking policy if it became unitary across the whole of the county. In other words, all car parks will be charged for. And of course, in my district, we don't charge for shoppers parking. We won't be. So that's that bit. And I noticed Blaby's only charging 10p an hour, or whatever it is now, or 30p. It's minimal amount. That was reduced after they put a higher price in. So these are the bits that were brought out at the meeting. But apart from that, talked about staff being transferred. That's covered in that. We've also gone through that this afternoon. Byron's gone. We covered that this afternoon. But no, nothing really came out of that apart from what David said about the planning and infrastructure that seems to be lacking. The other thing that came about was, of course, in the borough's 106 and district's 106 monies, the counties don't always put for what they want 106 monies. A lot of applications they don't put anything forward for that, so that's why they don't get any money. So that perhaps needs looking at internally here.
Okay, I don't think there's common agreement on that latter point about 106 claims, but what you presumably the point is, if it was a unitary, then that could be joined up. Or Yeah, a bit more. Okay. And just to let you know, Mr. Rhodes is still here. He's sitting right behind you. Brenda, you got anything on environment and transport?
Yeah, I think it's mentioned on the minutes as well about the added services that the parish councils may wish to take on themselves, and it's also pointed out that if they don't wish to take on any extra services, they won't be forced to or feel as though they have to, otherwise it won't get done. And I think that's a very important point to make with the parish councils. With Thermiston Parish Council is quite big, and it could take on, it might not, but it could take on extra services. But somewhere like South Crowson just wouldn't have the ability to do that. But saying that, I think we also need to be quite aware that probably the smaller parish councils may wish to join together to make their parish councils a little bit stronger on the rural communities. Thanks.
I think that's a very important point. If not formally, join together informally to work together. Yeah, okay, I think that's a very important point. Gentlemen, you've got a comment on environment and transport now.
If I could just make a point on parish councils, really. We had Jake here from the LRALC, and I quizzed him on this, and it may not be that parish councils don't want to take on things, but the legislation precludes us. I mean, I raised the actual issue of the use of red and white diesel, and that parishes can't use red diesel in the same machine for grass cutting a verge that they can on a park, because it's contrary to HMRC regulations. So there is a lot of work this council could do legally to look at some of those rules and actually lobby MPs and the government to actually change the legislation, which may then allow the third tier of local government to actually look at some of these things that they might wish to look at, but they physically can't at the moment, because the cost differential between white and red diesel would kill half the parishes. So I do think there is something we could do here to actually assist looking at those rules and regulations, which may have major benefit for everybody.
Okay, that's helpful. Kevin?
Yeah, back to the parish councils bit. This morning when we discussed some of the financial side, there was, I think it was actually Byron mentioned the fact that highways at the moment has been cut enormously. And as such, apart from a few potholes, you're lucky to get anything. So the very fact that in this comment here, the comment was made that where parish and town councils wish to take on additional responsibilities, they would receive funding. I thought was quite interesting, because we've got to find funding from somewhere to fund those extra responsibilities, if that's the case. I had a meeting last Wednesday with a bunch of my people from the parish and district. I've got all the paperwork here, with highways. We had it here because highways wouldn't come out to the parish. Not because they wouldn't, but because the current process is that if you want to see parish, they come here. It obviously saves officer time and so on. That just, I think we need to be very careful about the fact that if we're just saying to parishes what I've just said, they're unlikely to support unitary if they feel that they've got to keep thundering up to County Hall every time they want to discuss a process that they want in their own village. Like
we did touch on this with Nick about the what I would call, some would say necessary because of the financial barriers that we've put in place. So, for example, third-party funded traffic calming works. They now have to enter into a lot of arrangements and ensure that they take on the future maintenance and liability of it. They have to insure against compensation claims under the Land Compensation Act. So there are, and it is making them think twice about why they bother to do schemes. So I think Nick's, who's not here now, he's obviously had to leave, but Nick's view was that if they're doing something that we're doing anyway, and they want to take that on and do it better or more efficient, that's fine. But where they want to do something which is not a priority to this council or is not a scheme that has gone through our process and been approved and has priority, then it won't change. They will have to still do all that. And I think that is a problem, but it's driven by the resources.
Agree.
But I think this does need setting out more clearly as we go forward.
I agree. Yeah.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I'll just one more example I'll come back on. You're right, and in fact, one of my villages is going through a county at the moment about some traffic, vehicle activated signs, and they've got a price out of county for the job. They've gone off to seek the independent prices, including fitting and all the necessary legislation. It's a quarter the price if you go independently.
I was just going to add, Chair, that in parallel to the Commission's discussions, we are continuing to talk with parish and town councils, clerks and members about a devolution framework and what that might look like. And the points that members have made are absolutely right. There's no imposition on parish and town councils. And services would only be devolved to parish and town councils where there is a business case, where it makes sense. And thinking about your last point, there will be more detailed information provided in the business case in due course.
Does that answer your question, Kevin? Right, so I think we've covered off the committees in terms of the key issues. So thank you very much for that, Simon, for contributing to that. So really, we're now at the conclusion, and it's not really for me to wind this up and conclude. We all need to do that. The plan at the moment, as you know, we have to produce a report of, is it 4 meetings we've held? Yeah, 4 meetings that we've held, plus taking into account all the committee work that's been done. And we have to submit that to the Cabinet. Now, ideally, Nick would like that next week, but obviously that's not going to happen. Now, being realistic, we need to have some discussions with him about that, and obviously with other members of the Cabinet. But I think realistically we're going to be looking at March. That's a personal view, but you know, Rosemary, she has another job to do, as do all the other staff. But what we have discussed with Peter and Rosita and Terry is that before that goes to the Cabinet, we all need to sit, and be able to agree it, ask for some changes, or say, look, something's been missed, or we really don't agree with that. So it's not something that on this occasion I think we just expect the officers to go away and do. There needs to be an input into that. So the proposal is that working through the commissioners, no doubt there'll be several drafts, and then we bring that to the March meeting. Is that? Yeah, that's what we're working to. I've got to have a discussion with Nick about this. This is just thinking at the moment. But what is clear is that the Commission will need to effectively sign off the report that we send to the Cabinet. So if anyone's not happy with that process or wants to make a case for a different process, now's the time to say something. But what is clear is that the route in, if there's any issues that people think of or want to say something about now in the immediate future, needs to be through the Scrutiny Commissioners. And then a report will start to come together and then come back here. Rosita.
Yes, of course, it is up to all the chairmen to feed in, and obviously they can forward their comments to either yourself or Rosemary. But I have got a couple of comments. Now, the leader, referred to on page 18, as we've earlier said, about parish councils. So, and I think the point I think somebody made, it is that we make that clear in the draft as well, what provision there are possible. But my main concern was when the leader and Tom were talking earlier on, and we were talking about planning and the area committees, that when I said it was very much strategic, but he referred that he would have liked to have seen more of an idea from us that can go to public consultation. So I think that between us we need to put some more ideas into it, because for one, I think an area panel should be proactive rather than officers talking to the public as they did when we had community forums. I also think we need to spend a little bit more time in looking at what areas and where to hold these, because again, people will not come here and there will be some cost commitments. There needs to be some thought of task panels to work from the area committees, but mainly I think we also need to look, i.e. in planning and into area committees, at some public participation and how we're going to do this. Because in my opinion, this unitary proposal is built on public participation and having the goodwill, and we can only do that by making sure that there is adequate public participation put into the proposal that the general public can buy in. So I don't know, Chairman, whether we want to do that and then add that to it into the report, or how we're going to do that, and it's over to you. But I think that needs to be addressed before we go forward. I don't know what members of the Commission think, so that's just my idea. But say now or forever hold your peace.
I agree with what Councillor Page is saying about the importance of engagement. I think how we write this report is going to be critical. One of the things that we could do is we could write our view of how we think area committees will work, and then we go out to the public and say, this is what we're going to do, and do you mind? And they can say, yes, we mind, and we'll say we're going to do it anyway, which is a kind of classic county council consultation as I see it. Or we could actually do it in a way that sets out the questions in our report that would need to go into any future public consultation. What are the options that we could have? Or do we have some, a model that is very regular, that has regulated, that is able to take devolved decisions? Do we have a model that is much more community? So these are the kind of options that we've got, so that the public get a genuine consultation where they can really get involved.
I mean, you mentioned consultation. My understanding is no decision's been taken yet on whether we're going for that. There's going to be a business case. Whether then that, and I understand that will end up, after it's gone through Cabinet, there will be a report to Council. I'm looking, gentlemen on my left, to correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong. There hasn't yet been a decision whether we're going to the next stage, which effectively would be public consultation with the residents of Leicestershire. So we could do that. It's not for us to underdo that.
That is not
okay.
what we say.
No, just to clarify, I wasn't saying that we write the consultation document. Good grief, no. But how we write our report, we can write it in a way where we're saying we've already got all the answers, or we can write our report so that it makes clear that these are the questions that we all need to think about if this were to go beyond a business case, so that we're not kind of coming down on for a particularly fixed view on anything.
But to make it clear that we would like to see in the area and in the planning process public participation, because it's not within the report, it's not listed there.
Out very much today as a priority. Let me just get an input, and then Byron can respond.
I'm just getting slightly confused, Chair. I think my understanding of this was that we were looking at this, we were going to come back with recommendations which will be in certain areas. So recommendations will be things that we agree with, things where we want more information, things where we might want additional witnesses. So for instance, we've not yet had the opportunity to talk to anyone who's done a dual unitary authority, so I would still welcome the opportunity to see someone like Suffolk who've been working on it for 10 years, but that's a personal thing which I appreciate might not be possible. And we then need to look at the corporate governance issue. So what is the corporate governance? So how are the area committees going to work? How does the planning legislation work? How do we ensure that we have a council, or unitary council, should that be the route we go, that the public believes is open and democratic, etc. So we might need to do some work on what powers of delegation go to cabinet in future, because with a large unitary you wouldn't want just 6 people making the decisions on every single matter. I'm not saying they shouldn't on 90% of it, but some of it perhaps needs to come to full council. So there are those sort of issues. So to me it's a question of making those recommendations, which will then go into the business case. The business case will look into those and take those into consideration and hopefully provide greater information and more input. That business case will then come back to this committee for us to scrutinise and say whether we're happy or not. Was my understanding, at which point it will then go to full council, presumably with some sort of chart on public consultation, should that be the case to be decided.
Well, it's open to the Commission to say what it likes, and according to the judgments you've reached, and having heard all the evidence, that's what your task always is. And so your report can be as far-ranging as you wish it to be. As far as then the process goes, that report will be an input into the next stage. And as you know, the leader is minded to go to writing a business case. And of course he announced that at the council meeting last time, and if you know, in his position statement. I think that to the actual process from then, there needs to be a formal cabinet decision on that, and then at some point later in the year there will be a business case will be produced, and then we'll go to the next stages. But the Commission's report is going to be a valuable input into the creation of that business case.
Okay, that's helpful. I don't think that changes what we originally suggested. That our task now is to get on and produce a report. What then happens after that will be decided elsewhere, and whether we then come back to some of the issues you've been looking. That's for later on, depending. Yeah. So I think that the objective is to try and produce a report that can come here in March, be signed off or otherwise, and then is sent to the Cabinet, and they take it from there. And to do that, we need to progress that and then bring it back here. Is that a reasonable conclusion? And then you can shoot it down or change it or ask for change amendments or whatever at a point. Right, so unless anybody's got any other comments, I'm going to close the meeting. Can I remind you that we are here again on the 28th, where the focus is on the medium-term financial strategy. Byron will be back with us then. Thank you very much.